Welcome back from your day of not having to be on campus. I wouldn't say off day, but probably most of your professors didn't give you the day off. So, I should have the quizzes graded by the end of the week. So if I have an issue with whoever you picked, which I probably shouldn't, as long as you use someone decent, you'll be notified through the quiz. But no, those should all be graded, and then you can start working on your next writing assignment as soon as you want to. So. In looking, last time looking at the application of justice in war, especially the application of all of that in the execution or the carrying out of the war. The greatest example we looked at, of course, was the atomic bomb. Who made the decision for that to happen? For it to be dropped, yes. Yes, it wasn't the military that made that decision. Though, of course, that they had their own process and whatnot. It was the president, Harry S. Truman, at that point. So, obviously, a major part of justice involves government. It involves politics, right? Justice is not just something that is done on an individual scale, it is done on a communal scale. And even in a world that is very increasingly interactive, interconnected, and it's even a global scale. And so this, of course, involves politics. The participation in the work of the many. Politics is an area that is always very sticky. Because, especially in sort of democratic or Republican systems, we are choosing people, while yes, we have our say, we are choosing people as our representatives or our delegates or our designates to stand for us. The issue that arises for the individual is, what is my part or what is my role to play in the political system? Always feel very overwhelmed. Think about it. We live in one of the largest populated nations in the world, over 300 million people. If even 25% nationwide vote, that's about 75 million that voted. It's like, well, what does that mean for me? Or, why, my vote doesn't matter that much. Well, yes, in one sense you could say that's right and true. But also there is the responsibility to what we believe and what we think is right and true and just and moral. We owe that to ourselves as much as we owe that to the country, to everyone else. Politics is a cooperative action. It is not just something that is done on an individual basis. And yes, cooperative actions must be weighed and judged for their moral value. But the issue becomes, how responsible can we be, or how responsible are we for the actions of politicians? So, the first example, Harry S. Truman is the one who made the final decision for dropping the atomic bomb. Is there a responsibility on every American who voted for his party, at least, since he wasn't the president at that time? Is there a responsibility on every American who voted for him and for FDR? Is there some sort of culpability, in other words? Or is it just or exclusively on Truman? Well, Truman did that himself, and why? Since it's a cooperative action, he didn't just get there himself, but he also had help, especially the help of voters. We have to weigh it in the sense of how all these things can be judged towards us. What is their moral value? And this is kind of the scale of our cooperation in any act. Because we act communally. We live communally. We live in a society. All this happens. So we need to understand how all this can be done. There's, first of all, the level of the cooperator. And this is the cooperator is the one who assists in some way. Pretty simple, right? So in the example of the atomic bomb, the decision to do that was Truman's. But he is not the one who piloted the aircraft. He is not the one who devised the bomb. He's not the one who shipped it. He didn't do it all himself. He needed the help of others. So how much was their cooperation going towards this action, going towards an ultimately evil action? How much is their responsibility, therefore? The example, of course, of cheating, right? How much are we responsible if someone cheats and we don't help them versus if they cheat but we do help them? We are called to avoid evil. But sometimes it's very hard to do that. So there are two types of cooperation. Two types of overall cooperation. The first is formal cooperation. Formal cooperation means that you intend the act to happen or to occur. So going down from the bomb example, the supreme commanders or the military command that recommended that course of action and encouraged it, participated formally in the dropping of the bomb. Therefore, one who formally cooperates is equally culpable, equally responsible, ultimately. Why? Because at the end of the day, they want it to happen. They are encouraging it. They are doing it in the deepest way possible of making it happen. Whereas material cooperation Material cooperation means that they do have some part in the carrying out of the action, but they do not intend for the act to happen. Yeah.
So, an example of that, would that be like people who were in charge of mining plutonium? If they didn't know it was going to the bomb, but they supplied material only, but
Well, I mean, yes, because that yes, because in a certain sense, all they are doing is providing the material. That's a very basic way of understanding it. All they're doing is providing material. They were not asked to assemble that material. It's just, at that point, let's say at that point, as they're still trying to develop all that, they've been, there's an order sent in. Hey, we would like 700 kilograms of plutonium. All right, there you go. So, another example in that instance, the Oklahoma City bombing in the late 90s. Timothy McVeigh and a couple others made a bomb basically out of fertilizer. Put it in a van and exploded it in a federal building in Oklahoma City. They went around and they purchased this fertilizer and these components in basic hardware stores. It wasn't like, they went on like the black market and got this material. No, much of it was easily available, and they knew how to mix it up. So those hardware stores, in a sense, you could say that they materially cooperated with that. They provided what was necessary, but they did not intend for that to happen. They probably just saw these couple of guys come in. Oh, they're getting, they're trying to mulch up the back 40 or something like that. There were plenty of people who buy that amount and probably buy more even. So it didn't faze them. It didn't, they were never asked, hey, we're going to make a bomb. Can you recommend some fertilizer to us? Oh, sure. Here's the best stuff. No. They were just doing their normal work. But as part of it, they materially cooperated. They did not intend for that bomb to be built and to be exploded. But they do have some part in it. That's material cooperation. This is where, under material, it can be broken down a little bit further. There may be some guilt attributed to it. There may not. It can depend. How? Two different ways. Either immediate material cooperation or mediate. So both of these fall under material cooperation. Formal is you intended. So everything you're doing is to encourage and to help. So for example, in that Oklahoma City one, Timothy McVeigh is always said to be the main plotter, but he had others who helped him with it, about 2 or 3 others. They formally cooperated in that bomb, versus, of course, the material sellers who just materially cooperated. So the question is, how do we distinguish that material cooperation? Question? Okay. First is immediate. Immediate material cooperation is providing the material that is necessary for the immoral act to occur. So think of this in the literal meaning of the word. Immediate means without a middleman. Right? It means automatic, without delay, without anything in between. Whereas immediate means there is something kind of in between. Immediate material cooperation. That you still provided the material that is necessary for the immoral act to occur. So, in material cooperation, you could, even if you're not encouraging the act, but if you're still providing that which is absolutely necessary. How easy is it to get an atomic bomb? It's not. The time Truman did it, there were only two working bombs. It's not like you go down to Lowe's or Home Depot, go down the shelf and pick out his nice little medium range bomb, nice for the backyard. So immediate material cooperation means that one is still guilty of assisting in that act, in that immoral act. Versus mediate material cooperation. Mediate is that you're providing the material, but that material is not completely necessary for the immoral act to occur. So, the example of, the more recent example, although kind of been in the back of our minds for at least a year now, the concern over school shootings, right? That, someone's going to come, some disgruntled student is just going to come in and to blow some of his fellow students away. Many want to blame the gun shop, maybe the local gun shop and whatnot, for that. However, in a country such as ours, where firearms and ammunition are easily obtainable, not just in local stores, but in the internet as well, that you can't necessarily blame the local shop. You can't say, well, one of these children is on your hands. Not necessarily. They could have gone the next town over and acquired those weapons. Yes, that the gun store owner has a material cooperation in that action, but it is mediate. They could have gotten that material anywhere else. They could have gone somewhere else for that to happen. Whereas, the same thing could be argued, for example, with the September 11th attacks. They used planes, right? Some want to in some way blame the airlines. What was it? It was at least 2 American Airlines flights, one United. What was the other one? I can't remember what the fourth one was. It was 2 and 2, yeah.
I think it was one of each of the towers, and then one of each in the Pentagon and the fields.
Yeah, I know the field one that's United 93. So.
Well, that was headed straight for the capital.
Well, it was headed for DC at least. We know that much. But anyway, they wanted to say that there should be some, some argue there might be some blame on the airline's part. But again, they're not the only ones who were flying planes that day. Delta was in operation. Northwestern. There were quite a few airlines in operation. Just because they were American Airlines or United Airlines doesn't mean therefore, that they formally cooperated, nor even immediately cooperated, like they were literally the only planes around. If it was, if it was a maybe nationalized, they were all one airline, there might be more of an argument for immediate. But here it's no, they're not culpable. However, we can also even break down some of that mediate. Why? Even if what is provided was not absolutely necessary, there can still be some culpability, because even if that which was possibly done or possibly necessary could still have been in some way contributed to it. Why? The example of mediate material cooperation in a general sense might be, for example, boxes of weapons and ammunitions, American weapons and American ammunition, go missing in certain places and just happen to end up in the hands of rogue nations. Yes, in one sense, they could have easily obtained it from some of those, but there still may be some culpability. If you leave the door open, oh well, time to end the day. I'm just going to casually look away while the door is left unlocked, and just if anybody happens to come in and steal weapons, well, that's the way it goes. There is still some cooperation. The two levels here are first proximate and then remote. So proximate cooperation is that even if it's immediate, even if it is immediate cooperation, if it is proximate, is that you make a contribution that leads to the commission of the act. In the example of the September 11th attacks, the terrorists were in the United States for months, even at a certain point, years before those attacks. They went to flight school, some down in Florida. Now, of course, there are multiple flight schools. There are. They picked a couple of them, but there are more than a couple flight schools, so they could have chosen from any one of them. But those instructors, without knowing it, still in some way helped them to be able to carry out those attacks. Some would place that under proximate. Their training of these terrorists was a proximate cooperation with that evil. Maybe we can talk about that in just a little bit more. Why? Because there's also, on the other hand, remote cooperation. Remote cooperation is that you make a contribution to the act that does not lead, or not necessarily lead, to the commission of the act. And participating in an approximate way means there is some culpability. You are guilty in some way, maybe on a far smaller extent. Whereas remote cooperation You perhaps may not be guilty if there was a proportionately serious reason to do so. So in that example of the flight instructors for the terrorists for 9/11, which would you say they fall under, proximate or remote? Who says proximate? Who says remote? Couple? Who says get on with it? In the end, it leans more towards remote. This kind of getting down here, it can be at times a little grayer than we want it to be. Yes, their training helped them to be able to carry out this deadly attack. At the same time, they didn't necessarily need the training to be able to do it, to be able to carry out the attacks. They could have just taken over the planes. Most people understand the very basics. You move the stick, you move the stick in a certain direction, and it moves in a certain direction. They use that training to make precision attacks, right? To be able to fly and to fly straight into the buildings. They could have just wung it, they could have just done it on their own. So in a certain sense, yes, it leans more towards remote. Why do we bring this up in the level of politics? Well, because there can be some responsibility on our part as voters, as the ones who do vote, if we vote, towards the behavior which our politicians do. Not all of it, though. Why? Because they are human beings as well. They are not robots that just do what we program them to do. That we translate politics and voting into programming. It's not like that. They are still individuals as well, with their own wills, with their own minds, with their own understandings, with perhaps their own moralities. Just because we vote for them, whether they win or lose, doesn't mean they're always going to follow what they say, or that they're going to act as we expect them to. We as human beings, we as moral creatures are not to cooperate seriously with evil. The basic morality that we all have is to do good and to avoid evil, whether we're Christian or not. Whatever our beliefs, we do what we believe is good, we avoid what we believe is evil. That's not always, we see here in cooperation, that is not always as easy as it looks, especially in a political environment. Right? How many of you, and I'm not asking who you voted for, how many of you voted in the past election? I'm glad to see that. I did too. I'm not going to. So, we as members of a voting political system, whether you want to argue it's fully Democratic or more Republican, this is not political science. We're not going to get into that debate. We are able to participate in it, but that means we cooperate in some way with what our government does. Why? Because we put it into power, right? Especially if we voted for the side that won. So, if you voted for the Democratic Party, if you voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they are now president and vice president, right? If you voted for, what's her name? No, who ran against Mitch McConnell? Amy McGrath. I knew it was Amy. I couldn't remember the last name. If you voted for Amy McGrath, you can say you're not responsible for what anything Senator Mitch McConnell does because you voted for the other one, right? The opposite case, if you voted for Donald Trump and Mike Pence, they're not the president and vice president. If you voted for Mitch McConnell over Amy McGrath, Mitch McConnell is still our senator. And a high-ranking senator at that. So not only does he have influence just as a senator, but as one of the high-ranking senators, he has even more influence. So we have some part versus a system where someone comes to power of their own volition, right? A dictatorial system where they seize power because they're at the head of the military. We don't have cooperation in putting that government into power normally, right? Not necessarily. Depends on how much we cooperate. So, a good example of this, Spain in the 30s went through a major civil war. The collapse of the democratic system, the fighting broke into two camps. The first was a more socialist or more communist based. That was backed by countries such as the Soviet Union. The other, a more nationalist, more fascist-oriented group led by Franco. It was backed by countries such as Germany, Nazi Germany, and fascist Italy. Countries split apart, as it were. In the midst of a civil war, it's hard to stay neutral. You almost have to pick a side. So in some way, almost everybody cooperated in that war. But how much was their contribution? The formal one would be instigating it. The material would at least be giving yourself to the cause. Here I am, I participate in some way. But then breaking it down further. This is why often in many places, Americans are not liked. Why? Because of the actions of the American government. And because we tout ourselves as democracy, the champions, the vessels of democracy, that, government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? Well, if that's what you claim, Americans, this is what your government has done. Therefore, you cooperate in that evil. It gets complicated because of the decisions of those in charge. What they allow and what they don't allow. That can move our cooperation in some way. Or in fact, completely remove it. Nobody thought in the year 2000, when they were choosing either George W. Bush or Al Gore, nobody thought they were going to be electing a president who would take us to war within 2 years. Nobody thought that. That wasn't on the radar. So, the cooperation of the American people in beginning the war on terror is nil. There's no cooperation. The war in Iraq, differently. Our principles as individuals must help shape the politics that we have. But we must also accept the consequences of those politics. Especially in our own place as the quote-unquote greatest country or most powerful country in the world. Everyone was looking to the United States in November, right? Because what happens in the United States affects the world at this rate. It's not the only place. The presidential election in the United States affects the world because what the president chooses to do has a major impact on the rest of the world. Economically, militarily, socially, even. But we have to weigh our political cooperation based on whether we are actually doing what we want to do. Are we in making these choices that we made, are we cooperating with evil or not? This is why one of the reasons why many don't vote. I don't even think our participation in the presidential election topped 50% this last year nationwide, maybe in certain areas. Many don't vote because they don't want to be seen as cooperating with evil. Because they see both parties, right? Many see both parties as being evil in some way. There's something that they do, something that they advocate that goes against their beliefs. But there are others who will argue that even though the two major parties do not have perfect platforms that one can 100% agree with, that the cooperation is remote enough with those evils, that I, as the voter, my cooperation with that is so remote that I can vote for this party over the other party. Why? Because they see in that as a proportionally serious reason to do so. What's the major Catholic political issue in this country? Abortion, right? Right? What is the position of the Republican Party, on paper at least, concerning abortion? Not necessarily by the actions. What is it on paper?
On paper, it's get rid of it.
On paper, it is against the principle of abortion, right? What is the Democratic position on paper? I'm not asking any of the actions. What is it on paper or in their literature, in their material?
Quote is safe, legal, and rare.
I don't know if they actually use that anymore. In general, in some way though, they support it. We'll go with that. So, R is no, D is in some way, yes, right? So Catholics had major arguments in the political spectrum in the election concerning who to be able to vote for. Many say because of, and we will talk about this much later, because of the position of the Democratic Party concerning abortion, even if many of their other policies or positions were favorable to the Catholic moral structure, that this support of abortion was serious enough that it would no longer be remote cooperation with evil, but it would be proximate or even perhaps immediate, which means there would be some guilt on the part of the voter. Others argued that argued the opposite. Despite the position of the Democratic Party on abortion, all of their other things are in line with the Catholic moral system, such that there may be only a remote cooperation. So even though they support, or in some instances advocate, abortion, that their positions were so much better than the Republican Party that yes, one could vote, but one would only have remote cooperation. So one would therefore not be guilty of participating in an evil act. Yes.
So, going off that last point, so if the prior point stated that if someone voted for the Democratic Party, they may have proximate or immediate cooperation. So if that second part, or the most recent part was true, where it was they agreed with a lot of the other Catholic moral teaching, how would that lessen the material cooperation in abortion to where it would be remote instead of proximate or immediate?
So how is it that voting that D, even though they support abortion, voting for the Democrats, would only be remote? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, specifically if, like, in that context of that second point you made, where even if a lot of the other positions were along with Catholic teaching. The
context would be that their argument was because of the positions of Republicans. Obviously, these are the two major parties. Most people only vote for the two major parties. They just do. That the positions advocated by the Republican Party are so immoral according to the Catholic moral system that one would have, if one voted for a Republican, even though they are anti-abortion, that they would, at a minimum, have a proximate cooperation with the evils that are advocated by the Republican positions. If not, at least immediate. So therefore, there would be some culpability on the part of the voter, on the part of the conscience of the voter. That because of my actions, arguments of things such as the imprisonment of immigrants at the border, the idea of going against any sort of some basis or some form of universal health care, things like that many argue, and we can go back and forth on their arm, we're not going to at this point, that argue that fit more in the Catholic moral system, which are positions advocated in many parts of the democratic system, Democratic Party. So therefore, the argument was if one voted for the Republicans, even if they have this anti-abortion position, that one is participating, if not proximately, at least immediately, in allowing those evils to happen. Whereas the reverse argument is that because of the evilness, the evilness of the act of abortion, the promotion of abortion, that voting for the Democratic Party is in that situation then, even if those other positions are good and in accord, is approximate, if not immediate, cooperation in evil. So what each position argues is, the one we're voting for is remote. The one the opposite is voting for is proximate or immediate. Because what they are arguing is there is a serious reason to vote for that. And that choice, although it may carry with it some culpability for some cooperation with evil, that it's still remote because of the seriousness of what's argued. For those more of the Republican side, they argue, abortion is so serious that we can overlook the other things. Whereas those who argued more of the Democratic position said the other things are more important than abortion. That help to clarify that? Why is this debate so big, so major, at least in Catholic Church? Why? Because we're not supposed to cooperate with evil. The difficulty, of course, especially in a system like ours, is we have two choices, right? And not every issue is necessarily as black or white as abortion, for example. Nor is it, are there a list of, 10 things all good, and it's all, one side versus the other. Not every Democratic voter supports everything the Democrats go for. Not every Republican voter supports everything the Republicans advocate for. This is the difficulty when you seriously only have two choices. Even if those choices do expand, though, it doesn't normally expand enough. In the UK, for example, there's usually about 3 or 4 major parties. In some places, it's more. The other issue becomes, though, it can be difficult for government to function. For example, Italy. Italy, I believe last I heard, since its kind of reconstitution after World War II as a more democratic system, I think the average governmental system has lasted about 18 months. Average. Because there's such heavy divisions between many of the various parts of Italy, between the many parties, that there is immense instability. This is the ultimate difficulty with participating in politics on such a grand scale. The ultimate thing that everybody hates, but everybody has to deal with, right? Compromise. We don't want to. At times, we may have to because of the choices that we have. We only have 2 choices. We can't manufacture a third. Now, of course, our participation in the political system is voluntary. No one forced you to vote, right? No one held a gun to your head and did any of that. But at the same time, we have to weigh the pros and cons, how we participate in politics. If we're going to live by the basic command of do good and avoid evil, we have to at least make sure that it's remote enough that we're not responsible for that. Questions, thoughts, comments on any of that? All right. So for Friday, read up on chapter 10. We're going to transition from the virtue of justice to the virtue of fortitude. So read up on the next chapter, and we'll see you then.